Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Night TV studio for a special edition of Inside Media. I'm Reena Ninan of ABC News, and joining us today, we've got a fabulous panel to discuss the new findings. Starting us off here, Dr. Karin Karlekar. She's the project director of the Freedom of the Press, an annual index that tracks trends in media worldwide, freedom worldwide. She coordinates a research, ratings, and editorial process for the index and also writes a number of the country's reports. And she holds a PhD, I found this fascinating, in Indian history from Cambridge. But also from NPR, we've got Jackie Northam, Foreign Affairs Correspondent for NPR News. She spent more than 2 decades covering war zones. I believe 5 wars, Jackie? 5 wars. That's pretty impressive. Lots of hotspots. She's also was NPR's National Security Correspondent, covering U.S. defense and intelligence policies. And I found this interesting. In '94, she covered the genocide in Rwanda, as well as the war between Israel and Hezbollah. That was also fascinating. And also finally joining us here, another expert in this area, Adel Iskandar. Adel is a PhD scholar of media and international communications. He's also the author and co-author of several works, including Al Jazeera, the story of the network that's rattling governments and redefining modern journalism. Iskandar's work deals with the intersection of media, culture, identity, and politics. And he's lectured worldwide on a number of topics at various universities. So a pretty round of applause for our incredible panel for today. Now, I want to start off and kick off the focus that we've seen right now, which is the 3 countries in the Middle East. There's so much focus in the media right now of the Middle East, and the 3 countries that have appeared to slide back: Egypt, Bahrain, and Israel. I spent 5 years in Israel. I was fascinated to hear that Israel was one of those countries that you probably might not necessarily expect. Why Israel?
Well, Israel does have one of the, obviously the most free media environment in the region, and it's really a regional outlier, but we've seen a number of trends over the last few years, and then particularly some things that happened in 2012, which were enough to push it into what we call our partly free category. One was the indictment of the journalist Uri Blau for possession of state secrets, which was the first time that this law had been used against a journalist in several decades. So that was a very worrying development that we saw during the year. And we also saw instances of politicized interference with media content at the state broadcaster and at other outlets. And then we also saw the economic impact of a free daily newspaper that is subsidized by its owner. And that had an impact on the financial sustainability of several of the other newspapers, which led to the bankruptcy and sale of one of the other dailies. So there were several issues in Israel that were enough this past year to push it into our partly free category.
Is there anything you can see in the country that could change, one thing that might change their score next year, that they could do differently?
Well, there were some positive developments in terms of Supreme Court decisions that helped to establish additional protection for journalist sources, source protection. And then there is sort of, I think, an ongoing effort to reform the public broadcaster, the Israeli Broadcasting Authority, which potentially could have a positive impact in reducing the level of political influence at the broadcaster. So there are some positive things as well. And as I said, the Blau case was sort of an exception rather than the rule. These cases don't occur every year, and so we would hope that, let's say in the absence of such a case next year, that potentially things might shift back.
Yeah, one case, what a difference how it can impact the journalistic community. Jackie, Egypt was also fascinating, and the influence there of Muslim Brotherhood since the elections last year. What's your sense about how they've kind of slid back on the ground as a journalist?
Well, I think there's certainly an intimidation factor, happening there with the Muslim Brotherhood, certainly in Egypt, and that. I think what was fascinating in Egypt was just the whole social media that took place. So you have citizen journalists and that, and it really helped prolong the revolution there. And I think the upshot of that is that the government came down much harder. They're much more aware of what can happen now in the future if this gets away. So I think there has been certainly an intimidation factor in Egypt, and I think you're seeing it in other parts for that reason as well.
Adel, how on the ground has President Morsi impacted the role of journalists? I mean, there are some pretty courageous journalists out there, incredible bloggers that are very defiant. It's almost like a calculus was taken. We're going to push forward even though some of us will die. What are you seeing on the ground there?
Well, I think to a large extent the situation in Egypt is a complicated one. I mean, the Fourth Estate falters and flourishes almost in unison. It keeps going back and forth. President Morsi, with his election in July of last year, there was a lot of hope. There was a lot of positive prospects that the old regime's way of doing things and the relationship to the press was going to dissipate. And I think it's reflected in the 2011 scores from Freedom House. So there was a tremendous amount of optimism. But it didn't take a long time before the clampdown began. And it started on a constitutional level. The pushing through of a constitution that disenfranchises journalists and forces them to operate within a very, very strict structural sense. And then, of course, once the constitution came through, there were, significant protests in the Egyptian streets. And that's when the police state started using its tool to sort of control journalists. And in fact, it was during Morsi's first few months that the first journalist in Egypt since his time in power was killed, Husseini Abu Daif, in December of last year. So that, of course, doesn't bid well as far as prospects go. But ending in December 31st of last year, it was a mixed bag. Today, things have, the trajectory didn't seem positive, and unfortunately, a lot of these negative sentiments have come to fruition. So we're starting to see Egypt basically spiraling out of control as far as the environment or the climate that it is necessary for journalists and reporters and media practitioners to do their job well without intimidation. So it's not going well, but nevertheless, as you said, there is a tremendous intransigence on the part of journalists. Many of them have seen what the old regime or the Mubarak regime had done under the NDP and don't want this sort of system resuscitated. And so they're fighting back. The Egyptian Professional Journalist Syndicate has elected non-Muslim Brotherhood members, and it was really a trouncing of the Islamists, a rarity in some instances.
And I'm surprised that this whole Arab Spring began with a vegetable farmer in Tunisia, with a stand lighting himself on fire, feeling absolutely irate at the way he was treated, and the way social media took that one incident in a little area and broadcasted it globally. Karin, what are we seeing in the trends of social media and how that affects press freedom?
Well, sort of exactly what you've been saying. We're seeing this contestation using social media where bloggers, citizen journalists are really pushing the boundaries and using these mediums to provide news and information, particularly in closed media environments where the traditional media is much more under state control. So that's a very positive thing. And we've seen that in a number of environments, including China, Russia, many countries in the Middle East and the Gulf region, but all over the world, actually. But in return, what we're seeing is authoritarian governments and also some democratic governments who are really trying to crack down on the internet and new media. And this includes a number of countries. I mean, China has a very sophisticated apparatus, but is sort of trying to expand its reach over microblogs and other new tools that are being used. Russia passed an internet law last year that could lead to more censorship of content. Thailand, the reason for the downgrade this year was the use of the lèse-majesté law to prosecute both journalists and web hosts and ordinary citizens. We're even seeing in very democratic countries like India that have really been cracking down on the internet and the use of social media. So it's definitely some positives and some negatives in a number of countries around the world.
Which is interesting that you mentioned this, Karin, about Thailand, because Asia was the only region in the study that didn't experience a decline when you look at all the points overall. Jackie, you spent a great deal of time in Thailand covering, and there's, it's called lèse-majesté, and it's a rule that they have, a law, where you can't criticize the king.
Yeah, and they take it very seriously. When I lived there, it was 20 some odd years ago, just in everyday life, the king was everything. People on the bus, when they'd pass the palace, they would why, which was, in honor of the king and that. So they do take it very seriously, and I believe that the courts there actually backed up this lèse-majesté because they say it doesn't actually contradict the Constitution as far as freedom of speech goes and that. And so they've really cracked down on, there was a couple cases where people were jailed and that type of thing. And it doesn't take a lot to make this offense. I mean, it can just be some slight, phrase that they have and people are thrown in jail. But they've really cracked down. But it does make you wonder if they're using that law to go after a bigger pool of fish, you
And
know.
why is
So,
that
so again, it comes down to an intimidation factor. You know.
Why is that so important, Jackie, for them that they don't criticize the king? What do they have to gain by being so strict
Well,
on that law?
I think they actually even have this in England still. I might be wrong about this, but it's just the way it is. It's a cultural type thing. It's a way of the government keeping control again, if you like. But you know, the king himself is revered. The royal family, by extension, not so much, some of them, but it's just, you know, again, it's part cultural, but I think it is part a way to just sort of keep control. And now, I think by extension, again, I think it's a way to just keep a lid on, you were talking about the microbloggers and, you know, with the internet and that, because it's a lot of these countries, I don't know how sophisticated Thailand, it's been years since I've lived there, but trying to harness what's going on with the internet. I travel all through South Asia and still parts of Asia and that, and I have to say that the governments there, they're really finding it difficult to control the internet and the power of the internet and the bloggers and that, because it can slip back. You know, these are a lot of nations that don't have the best democracy in the world or the best freedom of the press, or they have problems with the economy or with energy or anything else like this. And this is a way to really spark something. When you said just a few moments ago with Tunisia, it was a fruit seller. That's all it took. But there's a lot going on underneath to spark that.
And the governments around the world have seen the power of things like that.
It is astonishing, yeah. They understand, and a lot of times they just pull it down. And you know, in Pakistan, they just pull down YouTube, no problem.
And tell us more about that. You just recently returned from Pakistan.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time in Pakistan, yeah. And in Pakistan, we were talking about some of the good news stories. In Pakistan, like Afghanistan, has this burgeoning press corps, you know, it's just exploded. There's all these new, you shouldn't use those kind of words in Pakistan, I guess. You have all these new television stations and newspapers. In Pakistan, it's very vibrant politically. I mean, they have some heated debates, and they don't have a problem with but you know, you can go after the politicians, but let me tell you, if you start trying to connect dots between the military intelligence agency and the Taliban in Pakistan, you've got problems. A lot of journalists are killed just simply by doing that. So
it's a harsh reality.
It's a very harsh reality.
Adel, you've also, we were talking backstage just about how the other Arab countries, some fascinating trends also that we're keeping an eye on. Talk a little bit about the good changes we've seen in some countries that you might not have thought of.
You're putting me in a tight spot. I think, I mean, there's definitely a little bit of silver lining, and it's usually where you least expect it. So a country like Yemen, for instance, one that is not known to have a long history of an open press, but the uprising there in 2011 has really created some space for journalists to be able to challenge government. The number of newspapers that have been registered and ratified and licensed, and journalists who are beginning to report, starting to challenge you know, government's monopoly. The state media is no longer capable of sort of pushing through their agenda in the manner that they used to previously. The number of cases against, I mean, typically it was much worse, but the number of cases brought against journalists in Yemen has also declined as the government tries to at least signify good faith in their relation with journalists. So Yemen is a country that's often forgotten and dismissed as purely authoritarian all the time, and that of course is not the case. So there is some slight improvement in that respect. Yeah. But you know, to the contrary, you've got countries like Kuwait, which has had a long history of a free, open, competitive press, and we've seen it sort of decline last year, and I imagine it will probably decline again this year as the Kuwaiti press and Kuwaiti sort of activists experience some of the same things that Jackie's been talking about, both in Pakistan and Thailand. So, you know, Twitter messages, if you're saying something about the emir, it's probably going to come back.
Social media is amazing. You know, I remember traveling about a year ago with the White House press corps, traveling to Burma and being on the long Aung San Suu Kyi's home, and all of us getting internet. It was just fascinating about how, you know, everyone is just so desperate, and once you have the connection, how important it is. I want to let you guys know we're going to open it up in just a few minutes to questions in the audience. Our head of programming here at the museum, John Maynard, is going to have a microphone in just a bit, but I want to talk also about the economic effects. I was fascinated by Greece and the ripple effect that the euro has had on the economic crisis. Talk to us a little bit about what we're seeing in Greece.
Well, Greece experienced a pretty big slide last year, and we saw this trend in several countries in Southern Europe, but Greece, I think, was the most dramatic example, where there's on several levels. I mean, one has been because of the economic impact. There's been the closure of news outlets, layoffs of journalists. So just on the level of journalists being able to do their job, that's had an impact. And so outlets are closing. There's less media diversity. What we've also seen, though, is an increase in sort of legal harassment of the press and also physical harassment. So journalists trying to cover some of the very heated protests and demonstrations about, what choices the Greeks are facing in terms of, austerity measures or other major challenges for the country and the government. So journalists have been attacked at those protests. We've also seen legal cases against certain journalists who were trying to sort of write stories about corruption or other economic issues. So we've seen a pretty wide range of harassment and intimidation against journalists in Greece, and just their ability to cover what's going on in the country and to sort of serve in that watchdog role that the press traditionally has decreased dramatically in Greece.
Jackie, I know you've traveled all over the world, but how has finances, you traveled to a lot of countries that aren't doing so well economically, but how have you seen just journalists on the ground? How has that impacted in countries like Lebanon and Pakistan, where you've traveled to?
Well, again, if I can focus on Pakistan and Afghanistan, there are a lot of new organizations opening up, press organizations and that. And a lot of times there's the third country, that's come in and wants to impose its agenda, if you like. There's a lot of businessmen that want to impose their agenda and that. But, it's a healthy thing to have this many journalists. The one thing that I wish would be better is that the journalists would push back. They have these press conferences and about 1,000 journalists show up in Islamabad at any given time, but there's no questions. If somebody makes a statement, there's no hard back and forth and that type of thing. So the journalists go out there and they do question, but it's not always, it's not always hard enough and that type of thing. It's hard to say. I mean, we think you have sort of Fox and NPR here. They certainly have that in a lot of these countries as well. And there's just the organizations that are paying for the agendas to be put forth.
Fascinating. I think we're going to open it up to questions in the audience. If anyone has a question, we've got John Maynard over here who's going to pass around the mic. And if you could just tell us who you are, we'd love to say hello.
It's İlhan Taner from Turkish Press, Turkish Daily Vatan and BBC Turkish. My question is on Turkey. Is there any way, I believe Karin or anyone else would like to jump in, is there any way you can talk about this year's report regarding Turkey, and also as a second question, how do you see as a Turkey on the path to EU? On the other hand, it continues to slide back in this index almost every single year in recent memory. Thank you.
Well, our score for Turkey remained largely the same this year, but there have been worrying trends over the last few years in Turkey. And Turkey is obviously an outlier in a number of ways in terms of being a very democratic country and yet a very, very high rate of imprisoned journalists. It's now, I think, calculated at the highest number of imprisoned journalists in the world.
Is there a reason for that, Karin?
Well, I mean, there's several laws in Turkey that are being used against the press. There are anti-terrorism laws. There's also a law against criticizing Turkishness, or Ataturk, the nation's founder, so it's a sort of insult law. And there's really been a crackdown against a range of journalists in Turkey. And as I said, the number of journalists in the world is very high. So that's really what is one of the main problems in Turkey and the reason for its poor score. And we've seen continued use of the laws to imprison journalists in 2012. So it is definitely a country of concern for us and one that we're watching very closely because of this. It's quite an anomaly, I would say, in terms of what otherwise is a quite democratic country and is on the path to EU membership, but which has this very, very high number of journalists in jail.
Next question. Yes.
My name is Zakaria Unadabu from Radio Nigeria in Nigeria. My concern is actually bordered on the issue of the freedom of the press as a journalist on one part and the role of the media owners. Is there any effort to reconcile these two issues? Because the role of the media owner partly affects, the personality of the journalist himself on one hand, and then the role of government on the other hand, which means he is caught in between in between two issues. Stranglehold from the owner, stranglehold from the government. How do you reconcile these two issues so that we can
That's an interesting question.
Adel,
Adel, why don't you take that? Because we are seeing a lot in the Arab world. It's sort of interesting as well as in Africa.
I'm glad you brought up that question. I mean, there's no real sort of a formulaic answer. There's no real solution. Media owners typically call the shots. That's been the case in most of the world. And you've got sort of when there's a concert between the government and the media ownership, then you've got sort of a perfect authoritarian system. But when there's competition between the two, that's when things get a lot more complicated. There's an interesting example out of Egypt that just happened literally in the last week, where one of the prominent independent newspapers, Al Masri Al Yawm, which had been quite successful at becoming sustainable economically. They had a fairly good business plan. They were forced, or they forced their English language outfit, their English language newspaper called Egypt Independent, to shut down. And that's become a topic of great concern for journalists in Egypt, who are worried that they're basically being targeted on both sides. On one level by the government and the sort of institutionalization of legal measures that prohibit their action and their ability to cover stories freely on one side, and then you've got media owners looking at their product and suffocating it, whether it's for political reasons or because it doesn't conform with the political mission of their publication or of their media outlet. So I think this is an endemic problem that exists not just in Africa, but in the Middle East and elsewhere. In fact, it's a problem here in the United States as well in some respects. So media ownership in some cases is able to determine content and coverage. How to reconcile the two, I think the necessary action is for there to be legal safeguards to ensure that media owners don't overstep the editorial boundaries that are there to protect and ensure that journalists have a climate where they can do their work freely, openly, without daily infringement or the threat of a loss of capital or the shutting down of their operations.
That's fascinating. We'll take one more.
We have a question from Twitter, actually. This is from @ADHRB. And I'll just throw this out to the panel. How has the crackdown on free expression and press freedom impacted the situation in Bahrain?
Wow, Bahrain, where there's been a lot of a government crackdown and protesters. Again, it's another situation where people are fiercely fighting back and also being shot and killed.
I'm going to try not to overtalk, but Bahrain, of course, is a sort of a classic example of authoritarian media. The state controls all of the local and domestic media operations. Even the so-called independent press or opposition press that had been flourishing or doing fairly well before 2011 in the aftermath of the uprising or since the uprising, that's been shut down. Even foreign journalists and foreign reporters who are trying to cover the situation in Bahrain, most of them are intimidated. They've had their licenses rescinded. Many of them have been kept out of the country when moments of sort of activist eruption came into being. And even foreign journalists who are trying to make their way into the country to cover, let's say, the F1 Formula race, literally in consecutive years, they're cordoned and made, they're made to know or led to believe and led to know that if they were to cover the protests that are going on the heels of this race, that they will be facing the government's wrath. In many instances, deportation. And there are several examples that I think are very well documented. So Bahrain's slide back is I think, pretty drastic and dramatic, and is quite possibly the worst case scenario when it comes to Gulf countries. So it's very worrying, and the trajectory is not positive. We're not sure where it's going to go.
Interesting about Bahrain, though, is there is really a governmental full court press to reach out to the foreign press to give their side of the story. In fact, I've never had so many government people.
They're very savvy, aren't they, Jackie?
Yeah, they're very savvy, and I'm not sure how much good it actually does, but we get great tape, and so that's what we need, because we always like to have their side of the story and everything else like that. But they're it's interesting to see how they've reacted to this, the government's PR machine.
They understand the role of social media, especially in all of this, and the impact.
Yeah, and just and positive PR too. I mean, you don't find many other countries actually doing that.
Yeah,
that's for sure.
That's interesting. Should we take another question from the audience? Yes.
Yeah. My name is Al Hassan Sila. I work for the BBC African Service from Guinea in West Africa. The conversation is pretty nice. just that it's short on Africa, apart from Egypt. And I think the headline would rather have been Mali, which is dramatically, slid down the ladder. Now, I was just wondering, it's good really to bring out all of this stuff. I mean, countries, where people behave themselves, in others where, the behavior is not all that complimentary. But what are you going to suggest? What are you going to propose, just so that, these behaviors are discouraged in the sense of Mali, because there's lots of intimidation, journalists are being jailed. What are you proposing to these governments or those people that are responsible for trying to actually stifle the press?
That's a good question, Molly. We've seen Mali and West Africa a major decline. He raises a very good point, but what can anyone do outside of Mali to help with that situation?
Well, with Mali in particular, I think the situation is becoming stabilized as we've seen the French troops come in and try and retake over parts of the north. And hopefully there will be elections and a resumption of civilian rule in the south at some point soon. So I'm hopeful that trends in Mali will reverse back to where they were. It was one of the best performers in Africa. But just as a note, apart from Mali and Guinea-Bissau, actually elsewhere in West Africa this year we saw a huge improvement in a number of other countries in the region. It was one of the regions in the world which showed the largest amount of improvement. We saw really big openings, for example, in Cote d'Ivoire, following a new government that's come in and is really trying to do the right thing in terms of press freedom. We've also seen a number of other new governments in the region in West Africa, including Senegal, Liberia, also sort of either passing new laws or not clamping down on the press in the ways that previous governments used to. So I think when you do have let's say a new government coming in or a government that is interested in potentially reforms, that's also a very positive thing. And here I'd like to mention just the role of foreign aid and donor countries in providing some leverage. So in many cases, these countries are trying to get aid from, let's say, the US or the EU or other governments, and these issues can be brought up and saying you need to respect press freedom, you need to respect human rights in order to be considered for aid packages. And that's had a positive effect, I think, actually in a number of countries in West Africa, which have been getting foreign aid from the Millennium Challenge Account, which is a US government initiative that was started under George Bush, and it basically rewards countries for good human rights performance.
That's interesting. That's something you don't hear about, the correlation between aid and the impact of a free media in a country.
No, it's a very important issue, and we've seen actually a number of governments in West Africa trying to make important reforms in the media freedom sphere in order to qualify for these packages. So there is a very direct link. And that is one way that you can have leverage on a government to do the right thing. So that is sort of, West Africa's actually been a very positive success story this year in our index.
That's interesting. Okay.
Apart from Mali, so I wanted to highlight that,
yes, next question.
Tawil, Egyptian journalist based here in DC. I believe, guys, you focused more on the situation in the Middle East, but I would love to hear your comment about the situation here in America, especially a lot of media outlets, American media outlets, practice, I believe it wasn't a good journalism during covering the Boston attack, and there was a hate speech against the Muslims and the Arabs in many media outlets. And I believe when we evaluate the situation of the media in the world, it's not only about that we have a free media outlets, but also media outlets which is producing a good journalism. So I'm interested to hear your comment on this.
That's a really interesting point about the role in the U.S. The U.S. actually slid back a point in the study this year. What role does the White House play, particularly the Obama administration? Has that impacted the backsliding at all in any way?
Well, we have seen in terms of recently in the U.S. with the Obama administration, I think less access given to journalists in some ways in terms of sort of press conferences, giving information out. So there has been a sense that I think the government is being a little bit less open than one might expect. Also in terms of sort of broader issues of cracking down on whistleblowers and other things like that. And the previous year in the US, we actually saw sort of harassment of journalists that were trying to cover the Occupy Wall Street protests. One of the other things in the US we've seen in recent years, and this I think has happened in a number of other countries, is sort of media polarization, where you have less, sort of what you're talking about, less distinction between balanced journalism and then what you would normally think of as sort of the editorial page, which is like more opinion. And so many of the outlets in the US have actually become more about opinion than about sort of providing straight news and reporting. And this is definitely not just an issue in the US, but it's something we've seen in the US, particularly with Fox News, for example. and just the way that they report certain issues. And that's led to concern that we've had in our index in terms of just the level of balanced reporting.
And is there a way, Karin, to compare the Obama administration, let's say, to the previous administration? Has it been the same pretty much as far as access? Have you guys seen anything?
I think probably about the same. The Bush administration was quite bad, particularly with freedom of information legislation. There was many more, let's say, documents being classified under FOI provisions, and so that was an issue under the Bush administration, particularly in the earlier years. And the Obama administration did roll back some of those legal provisions in terms of the FOI law. But in terms of sort of just granting access in other ways, there hasn't been as much positive change as I think people were hoping, which is unfortunate.
Jackie, is there anything that surprises you as far as within the U.S. media when you compare it to your travels abroad? I certainly hope it's not like Pakistan or other countries where there is a major crackdown in certain fields that you mentioned covering. But is there anything that you look at when you come back home that surprises you about the field here? Or
I mean, I think it's probably more rounded here, I would have to say, than in a lot of places where I go, where you're just sort of a stenographer for the spokesman that gave the press conference or something like that. Unfortunately, it's getting better. In some areas, as I said, there's a very vocal media in Pakistan, very spicy when it comes to politics and that. I guess one thing, though, is I lived in England for a long time, and I guess you did as well, too. And it's probably a bit more combative, if you like, with the media and any sort of administration that's on there. They really challenge the government people there. And I find in the States that we don't do that as much. Sometimes there's a little bit of pushback, and I think that makes a difference. I think we still are willing to just accept, and I think we have to be balanced so much here. We have to make sure that if one person says that, then let's make sure that we get the other side of the story there and that. And I think that's one of the things. I mean, I think that's a very, very good thing, but I think we don't quite often make it very plain what is actually happening because we either don't want a lawsuit or we don't want some sort of negative pushback again. So I think it's a good, vibrant media that we have here and a very intelligent one, but still I think we could do better.
Can I add a quick comment, because I think the question is pertains largely to performance of American journalists, and I think one of the good things about the media environment here in the U.S. is the existence of various civil society organizations, media monitoring institutions whose sole job, of course, they range in the political spectrum from those who are promoting one side of a story and all the way to another, but their job is to basically act as safeguards for the watchdogs, or to ensure that journalists are doing their job. Now, that doesn't necessarily, and in most instances, doesn't translate into legislation that will infringe upon the right to express themselves and say whatever they want to say. So essentially, it's a free-for-all. And it's only in circumstances that Karin mentioned where the government interferes, where in the case of whistleblowers and what have you, which I think is quite restrictive. But there needs to be, I think, here in the U.S. Sort of a going back to the standards and revisiting how stories should be told, especially when the term terrorism comes into the play. I mean, because some of the standards go out of the window as soon as terrorism becomes the subject of analysis.
Especially the trend and how quickly you've got to move. It's tweeted out once. It's such a different. You don't wait till 6 o'clock or your evening broadcast.
Yeah, but we got to be careful with that too.
Yeah,
with those tweets,
those
because they could
will
sure be
get
wrong.
You in trouble.
Yeah.
Is that on?
My name is Edmund. I come from Rwanda. I'm glad one of the panelists is from said she covered the Rwandan genocide. My question is, one of the reasons that the government has advanced for putting restrictions on the media is that they say they cannot allow the media to slide the country back into chaos. As you might be aware, the media played a big role in the genocide. What do you think is the dilemma between allowing free media and then such media draws the country back into a situation as big as the genocide? What do you think can be done for such countries in such a situation? Thank you very much.
And you said you're from Rwanda?
Yeah.
Rwanda.
Yeah.
And Jackie, you spent a great deal of time in Rwanda. Talk to us about that.
I actually went in 4 days after the genocide started. We had to hitchhike in, actually. But You're right. You're absolutely dead right with Rwanda. Is that the radio was used to actually keep the genocide going, to call people out, to go after the Tutsis, incite the violence. Yeah, I was trying to not say it, but yeah, definitely. So that was a real problem. And I think with the political situation in Rwanda right now, and actually in that whole region with Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi still, from what I understand, I haven't been back in years, but from what I understand, there's still a power struggle there going on. I don't think it could ever be used again as it was the media to sort of promote this sort of violence at all. But it is being used again as a way of controlling information, as keeping the press in line with what the government wants there, and again more regionally as well. So I think it is a very fine balance, but I think, and again, I'm not there to actually say if it's being used. You might be able to address this more with Rwanda, but yeah, I think it is being used to control the information for sure, but it's not being used to any extent as it was in 1994. But I don't know. Have you checked Rwanda?
No, it's not. I mean, I think the government is keeping the media under control because they want to keep political control in Rwanda. It's the genocide is being used as an excuse. But on a general, more global level, I mean, media responsibility and ethics and professional journalism is obviously an issue of concern in a number of countries. And I think it's happened particularly in countries, for example, like Pakistan, where you've seen huge increases and expansion of the broadcast media. And so there are many journalists going into that field who don't necessarily even have the proper training. And broadcast is such a more immediate medium than the print media that it does become a problem if you're sort of reporting breaking news, showing images that may not be appropriate, things like that. But as a press freedom organization, what we would advocate would be more training for journalists, more training in ethics and professional responsibility, in how to provide balanced coverage, things like that. So, the government cracking down on the press or enacting legal provisions which restrict the media on that basis or with using that excuse, we would obviously not be in favor of that. We would be in favor of trying to promote, self-regulation by the media sector, press councils that could address some of these issues of inappropriate content, rather than the use of very restrictive laws, which is what is happening in Rwanda, where journalists are being jailed for 20 years at a time for articles which are actually just critical of the government. They're not trying to incite anything.
It's so fascinating. I mean, when you talk about media training, sometimes there really isn't the option of media training. I think about when we went in during Libya into Benghazi, suddenly the guy who's frying falafel becomes our fixer on the ground, our eyes and the ears. I mean, you just don't necessarily have
his own take on things.
Has his own take on things, right? A lens to look at.
And in countries like that, I mean, which have opened up from being incredibly repressive and where the media were a mouthpiece, for the government, I mean, it will take a long time to establish those kind of standards, but it has to be done. But yeah, it's definitely a process. It won't happen overnight at all.
It takes a while. We've got another question up over here.
My name is Ákos Balog, and I'm from Mandiner Blog Network, Hungary. And my question is that how do you see the economical impact of the global players like Facebook and Google on the local content market and on the local economy and financial possibilities of local content?
And do you mean like covering the financial markets and that sort of thing?
No, I mean the advertisement income of the local markets that is taken more and more by the global players.
Is there a such thing, as Karin, when you look at these reports about the impact of these larger companies like Facebook? I mean, social media obviously is such a big impact wherever you look in any country. But how do advertisers, bigger companies, sort of impact the role in how media is shaped?
Well, they definitely can. I mean, what we've seen in general is with not just global companies, but with the rise of the internet, the advertising market for print media, particularly in many countries, has completely collapsed or has been very severely impacted. So print media in a number of Western democracies are facing financial cutbacks, staff layoffs, closure of outlets. Yeah, the US, the US is a major example in that regard. And that's really happening more in the developed world. So it's happening, I think, as a result of the changing nature of the media and internet content. What we've also seen, and I haven't seen it being done by these international companies mentioned, but advertising and subsidies can also be used by governments that are interested in trying to control the press and press content. So in many countries, government advertisements are one of the main sources of advertisements for the media. And if those are withheld or denied to certain outlets, it can really impact their financial sustainability and force editors to then change their tone of coverage. And this was threatened in Ecuador this past year. I mean, it's been an issue in Pakistan in the past with the government, and it's happened in a number of other countries.
We didn't even get a chance to get into Latin America.
Yeah,
which
but the impact of economics is actually, I think, quite widespread, and it's one of the more insidious forms of restrictions on media freedom. Most people and a lot of the media freedom organizations focus on attacks against journalists or on, very high-profile legal cases, but sometimes these economic factors can actually have much more of an impact on the media, and it's almost impossible to see. It doesn't really get reported that much unless there's a major issue. And so we try and cover it as much as we can, our index, but it's actually one of the hardest things to get a handle on.
Okay, so we're going to take one more question for the audience before wrapping it up today.
Hi, my name is Alex Stambaugh. I'm a student at George Washington University, and I just had a question about framing. We discuss a lot about framing and indexing, and I was wondering where you saw the role of the government and the media in helping expand frames for media and share more stories.
Jackie, why don't you take that question? Because
I don't understand what framing is.
If I understand it correctly, it's how the government has helped to shape stories that we cover. Is that?
And how going forward, we're kind of moving beyond. I mean, our media now is very center. We usually, put one story out there, and that's the only thing that's heard. So how do governments help expand what is being heard by the people?
They call the White House the bully pulpit, and in many ways, every country kind of has their bully pulpit and ability to really use their megaphone to get out there. Jackie, how have you seen the way government has effectively been able? We talked about this earlier with Qatar, Bahrain. We were talking about the impact of them.
Yeah.
How has that helped?
Helped or hindered.
Helped or hindered, actually, you're absolutely right.
Yeah. It's, I've been in Washington 10 years now, and I had no idea what actually goes on to get a story out. There's, before I came here, certainly. And there is definitely an agenda, something, and it's actually, one gets worried because it can seem quite nefarious at times, just how they do want to get a story out and how they'll play it and what instrument they'll use to get a story out. I'm thinking of one of the major newspapers or one of the major other news outlets or that, where they're leaked information. And when I first came here, I thought, God, I must be a really lousy journalist or something. Why didn't I get this story? And I was only afterwards when, I was pulled aside a couple times by people and said, well, this is how it actually works. These people are leaked this information. So that's been a real eye-opener for me. The other thing is how they can deflect a story as well. In other words, if there is something really brewing out there, how the administration, any administration since I've been here, can actually come up with another story that is just as spectacular, but a much different context, if you like, a whole different issue in that, just so it takes your mind off this other story here. So it's huge, and we're talking about with Bahrain, you do get this. It's sometimes I pick up the phone and it's from a high-level administration official, just chatting, see, and then just a little drop a hint on that. It's quite remarkable, and they're very, very polished here, but they're polished in many other areas of the world as well. Sorry.
I think it's also kind of useful to look at the various ways in which governments are able to use both institutions. I mean, when you talk about framing, you're typically talking about the ability to set like the storylines or set like an agenda, if you will, for the media to kind of follow through. But in some countries, you actually have full-fledged institutions that are there in place to ensure that there is continuity between the site of creation of a story and the way that it meets the audience. So it's not uncommon for countries to have ministries of information. With the Arab Spring, there was the expectation that ministries of information would basically wither away and disappear and be replaced by regulatory authorities, equivalents of the FCC or the CRTC in Canada, which is fairly typical. And that unfortunately has not happened. In the case of Egypt, of course, we have the Ministry of Information being resuscitated in all of its sort of extensions and is able to exact revenge on professionals, on a professional level, if you will, and also administer institutions that hire and employ somewhere in the range of 42,000 people. So these are very, very powerful institutions. So sometimes framing is not just the ability to place the story in the right place at the right time for the right people to bite the bait and turn it into like an actual, report, but rather a more sort of top-down hierarchical structure.
And as we wrap this up, I want to tease what hasn't even begun. It's not even halfway through the year, but next year's report, because Adel, you were saying there are already some fascinating trends. Obviously, last year's report ended on December 31st, but what are you looking forward to seeing next year that you're keeping your eye on?
That's a good question. I think for the Middle East, and I'm sorry to be kind of consumed by the Middle East, but I think there are two different trends that one should look at, and they both violate the basic rules of what constitutes journalism. On one side, you've got citizen journalism and what citizen journalists do and whether or not bloggers should be seen and perceived as professionals and reporters. Because in many instances, at least in the Middle East, publics are accessing information that's not coming from the mainstream media anymore. And so what are the legal safeguards to protect these folks from, while they're covering stories? So that's one aspect. And then the other aspect is the S word, sectarianism. Which I think is becoming a much more salient, divisive political tool on the part of various media organizations to serve specific political ends. Some cases in conjunction with the state, in other cases in conjunction with an opposition, or at least the language of sectarianism. I mean, that's spreading in the Middle East. And you could look at it both from the transnational media, the satellite stations, as well as local domestic publications, all the way down to community newspapers. So there's a growing language of sectarianism. How it's going to factor in to the evaluations next year is going to be hard to tell, but I think that's sort of a rising issue.
Yeah.
Jackie, any final thoughts?
I would watch Burma, Myanmar, to see what's happening there. This was a country that really had no independent media for so long, and then, as it's opened up since 2011, you are seeing a media that is flourishing, a media that's not as intimidated, as frightened of the government, that type of thing. I think there's still problems there, but it'd be interesting to watch what's going to happen in Myanmar. I think,
so you're watching Myanmar.
Yeah.
And what about you, Karin? What are you looking towards for next year, you think?
Well, definitely, I think to echo what Adel and Jackie were both saying, I think it's important in some of these countries that have experienced the huge openings over the last few years, Tunisia, Libya, Burma, and others, to really try and keep the spotlight and attention on those countries and really make sure that they enact very positive, strong legal frameworks, strong regulatory frameworks for the media, because they really have a chance with these openings to sort of get the legal frameworks right if they do it. And I think there needs to be a lot more international attention from donors, from the media, on sort of ensuring that happens, because it is a really good opportunity with these big openings. Unfortunately, as we have seen in the Middle East and a number of other regions, there has been even continued backsliding from the trends that we're releasing today. And obviously Egypt is one case, but there are a number of others. So I think obviously increased vigilance on the subject is warranted, especially in some of these key countries. But there's obviously a number of countries of concern where we've seen a lot of backsliding even at the beginning of the year. So
and how quickly that can happen,
yeah,
too.
Exactly.
So Adel, Jackie, Karin, thank you guys very much for joining us. There is also a lot more at freedomhouse.org, the full report for anyone who's interested. And thank you to our audience members for joining us and for your great questions.